Hello, everyone. This is Shaina Silva. I'm here with my co host, Daniel Silva, and this is the Haiti Prosperity Podcast. We're sharing perspective on the state of Haiti today, exploring the different facets of the challenges the country faces, alongside the plethora of opportunities that these challenges also present that, if explored, could lead to improved quality of life for Haitians and overall shared prosperity for the nation. In the last episode, we touched on institutions and governance and how the structural forces that we've been talking about since the beginning of the podcast, which include economics, demographics, technological, and environmental, forces, and how the governance of these four major structural forces is critical for a country to position itself for prosperity. We touched on the need for having a sense of identity, trust in institutions who are doing the governing, the need for a complete restructuring of the government and even the private sector in order to effectively service this growing population, among other things. Essentially, summarizing the last episode with the need for a complete reset and reformatting of Haiti as a nation. Now, in this episode, we're going to dive into the future and do a bit of a verbal simulation of what could happen in a worst case scenario if the poor governance of these four structural forces were to continue to degrade. But before we jump into this simulation of the future, of the worst case scenario of the future, Dad, you've been working on a few very interesting things in the past couple of months around simulation. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about what that is so that it helps our audience to also understand the concept of simulation, what it is, and how it could actually be helpful in forecasting the future.
Thank you, Shaina, for allowing me to interact with your audience or our audience now. Um, as far as Haiti prosperity is concerned, and some of the things that I've been involved in the past couple of months. Well, we've been working on some interesting products at DMS International, which is about the development of simulations. Those are actual softwares that simulate key elements of public policy. So since we support mostly government customers, so our simulations evolve around developing best case scenarios for public policy. And essentially, when we say simulations, is as far as the technical aspect of that, you have to build systems dynamics as the base of the different parameters that deal with those simulations. And you put on top of those systems dynamics a layer of the topic at in case. We've developed so far three cases, pandemic management being one of them, the development of a viable and sustainable transportation system within the metropolitan area, and thirdly, food security. Those are three simulations that students can come in, and students or government officials can come in and play, to do some gaming around those topics and come out with the best policy that those different competitors could come out with. So it's a real competition, it's exciting, and people are really motivated, and it actually helps at actually developing the proper policies that will be used in real life.
That's fascinating. So essentially, leveraging technology to simulate the future and what it could look like. And you gave an example of the pandemic and simulating a potential outcome for the pandemic, and having, in this particular case, students think through the types of policies that would need to be put in place to manage these different types of scenarios. Scenario A, you need this type of policy. Scenario B, you need that type of policy. And based on the scenario that ends up being played out or selected or chosen, those policies would actually end up being implemented in real time. Is that what you mean?
That's correct, because the system dynamics allow the different competitors at knowing which policy would be most productive, most performing. So yes, essentially you would have, and that's the introduction into the world of metaverse, because in the metaverse world, and then maybe later on we'll define what the metaverse is, which is sort of a simulation of real life. You end up building a twin of reality. So you build, if it's in the case of a city for a transportation system, you essentially build a twin of the city in case, and you start simulating traffic and cars and public vehicles, etc., etc., to get a sense of how the transportation system would work in the real city. So the development of the replica of the actual city.
So it, in a way, allows you to test the future before living the future, and which is exciting as well because then you reduce the margin for error because you kind of know and can predict what's going to happen if you build a city this way. If mobility is moving in certain patterns, you're planning for those patterns and essentially completely reducing cost. You're completely reducing margin for error, and you're involving a lot more quality of life elements into the planning aspect because now you're not reactive to what's happening. You are proactively building the future by testing it out first.
That is correct. And in fact, it helps you as well, um, in terms of the collaboration and cooperation of different actors. For example, in our pandemic simulation, we have a minister of public health, you have a minister of finance, you have a World Health Organization representative, you have C executives that constitute the team for the particular country in case. So, the efforts of people collaborating and sharing knowledge takes place within the simulation. So in the world of public policy, that's called de-risking. So you're taking a good chunk of risk out of the equation.
That is exciting. Exciting because a lot of our state actors today, in the context of Haiti, are not necessarily collaborating in a conducive manner that would allow for a best case scenario to happen. And it's sometimes not necessarily because they don't want to, it's because they cannot see the potential that can come out of actually collaborating. So, what ends up happening is that their own beliefs, their own political beliefs, is the driver of governance versus the scenarios in which they could prosper. So, if we could remove the aspect of personal political beliefs out of the equation and replace it with simulated scenarios of prosperity, you can easily see where you fit in the equation, where you will gain from it, and you can significantly increase the collaboration amongst state actors, whether it is at the federal level, the state level, the city level, the neighborhood level. Everyone can actually participate in the formation of building this future.
Absolutely. And we have within our simulations representatives of civil society as well, because they have a role to play in any management at a national level of sort. So it doesn't become a ministry versus civil society situation, because within the simulation the executive get to feel and live the role of everybody within the context of resolving a crisis of sort.
Brilliant, brilliant. And this is why technology is really a game changer for building the future, because it allows you to build it before you experience it in real life, such as the simulation can do. Now that we've explored some of the things you've been working on, and definitely want to use that experience in the context of this conversation, where we want to be able to paint a picture or a verbal simulation of what a worst case scenario for Haiti would look like based on the things we've been talking about, which a lot of it has been around lack of identity, poor governance, lack of trust in the institutions that we have today, all the things we've been touching on since episode 1. Can you do this verbal simulation exercise with us on what would the future look like in an absolute worst case scenario?
Well, it's a difficult simulation for me, as when we simulate, it's to obtain the best possible scenario. However, worst case scenarios exist as well. And in the context of lack of governance and pessimism getting into the youth mind, and not seeing a bright future, and exacerbated by politicians that may have interest in such mindset, you may end up in a path where polarization and populism uh, go hand in hand. Polarization is by getting the two extremes to feel that their opinion and their mindset is the proper one, and populism is just about exacerbating that polarization itself. So once you have that at the human level, you're going down a path of constantly pushing for the different opinions within polarization, which lead to manifestations. You always have strikes and protests and things of that nature, which gives you, very unproductive days, which affect GDP. And it's a vicious circle where people will continue to suffer, and polarized and populism evolves in that.
So essentially, right now, in the current state of the country, as you've described it, the polarization of different political opinions is creating a sense of non-unification, a non-united Haiti,
Yes.
where we do not have a sense of being behind a single vision for the country, because everyone is standing behind their vision or their personal beliefs that are tied to a political agenda versus a country agenda.
That is correct. And once you go down that path, institutions start weakening, that's weakening themselves, which we currently have in the 2022 years, where the executive body is not following the constitutional structure as far as having a president and prime minister and the proper ministries. And the parliament only has a piece of the Senate, so you don't really have a parliament. And in terms of the judiciary, most of the main judges are not those posts are not filled. So you have the three bodies that constitute the nation uh, not being effective, and that leads to what you would call state collapse, and that's where we are today.
State collapse. And I think that was exacerbated by what happened last summer, where the president was assassinated, which now has completely removed a head of state. So the state collapse really led to a degradation that continues to go further or deeper into a negative scenario, because the institution of the presidency doesn't necessarily exist. And as you've mentioned, the other governing bodies also do not have leaders in those positions. Like there is no body there. The parliament is almost vacant. So there is a vacuum in terms of leadership of the country, where we don't actually have people making decisions for a country's prosperity.
That is correct. And prosperity goes hand in hand with security. And at this stage, the civil society does not necessarily trust the security forces represented by the National Police Force. So when a person, a citizen, gets stopped by a police person, that citizen does not know whether or not it is a real police person, or is that person going to be abused or violated. So that creates an insecurity which does not lead to prosperity and productivity.
And I think that's one of the most important layers. As you've mentioned, prosperity goes hand in hand in security. And if you can't even tell if the institutions and people who are supposed to protect you are actually who they say they are, then you don't have any sense of security in the country at all. And I think that was made very, very apparent with the presidential assassination, where even his own security could not protect him. Usually, the president is the most secure person, the safest person in a country is the president. But even his own security could not protect him, let alone an average citizen. So security has completely collapsed.
You also find the aspect of insecurity as far as property ownership is concerned. People are land is gets invaded by groups of individuals, within which you find even some police forces, some judiciary personnel involved in the process of taking over a person's property. So not only are you insecure physically as a person, but one can even lose one's property through people that are there to protect one's property, which is extremely important as far as prosperity is concerned. So if we go down that path, if we continue to go down that path, it gives you sort of the worst case scenario that we've been talking about.
Wow. So, really, not only are you not safe as an individual in terms of having a police force that is there to keep the streets and neighborhoods and cities safe, but your own assets are also not safe, not secure, not protected, where your land can be taken from you at any point in time, sometimes without even notice, where there is no paper trail for going to court
Court decision.
in fighting for your land and knowing that because it is under your name that you will get it back. There is no such process in place to really ensure that your assets will remain yours. So the security problem is not just personal livability security, it's assets as well.
Correct. And as far as the judiciary is concerned, when you finally get to go to court with a lawyer and the system, the judiciary system, you cannot necessarily trust that you'll get a fair judgment because the judiciary may end up getting paid or pressured to make the wrong decision as far as the court system is concerned. So I touched on all of the elements that uh, affect or impact an individual's activity toward prosperity.
This is critical. Security is the fundamental element, or really the starting point of establishing a sense of prosperity, is knowing that you are safe, knowing that your assets are safe. And I would say, I know in previous conversations, before even the element of safety, you have to have an element of trust. And so I have to trust that you will keep me safe. So even before touching on the element of safety and security, I have to have a reason to trust you. And today, the way that our society is currently functioning, that first element of trust does not exist. Would you agree?
That first element of trust does not exist at all. Another area of mistrust is political mistrust, because if you end up having an opinion, which is the democratic process requires that you can have an opinion on the conduct of public affairs in the country, but if you make the wrong statement or have the wrong opinion toward the way that public affairs should be conducted, you may end up under political violence, which is not an element for prosperity either. I'm sorry to underline the different elements that lead to a unprosperous uh,
Scenario.
nation. Yes.
And but it's reality that we should be exploring, and as heavy as it feels, these are some of the concerns that are very real today and that we should be really reflecting on. Do we want to continue going down that path where we have institutional mistrust, where we have political mistrust, where we have civics mistrust, where we have corporate mistrust, where we have educational, health, infrastructural mistrust? All of this is really a setup for failure. So, in essence, we really need to look at how to regain the trust of the people. And given the fact that we've already explored a lot of elements in a worst case scenario, what we will do in this follow up episode is talk about a best case scenario. We've touched on a lot of things that will lead us down a path of destruction. But in the next episode, we're going to explore the path to prosperity. What would it look like if we actually did the things to rebuild trust, to rebuild a sense of security, to rebuild our economy, to put the skills in the hands of this growing population who is a capable workforce? What would happen if we were able to do all of that? Any final words before we migrate and close out this episode?
Well, essentially, within this episode, we've gone through the description of the existing situation. We didn't even go into simulating the next 10, 15 years doing what is happening right now. And I cannot even imagine what that future would look like. So essentially, we've only been describing the status quo, the actual situation. If we were to simulate that, um, it would be a depressing conversation.
And we don't necessarily want the depressing conversation, but I think a reality check. There's a situation where it might become occupied. When you have a collapsed state, you will have neighboring countries wanting to take over and occupy once again, like the United States did back in 1915. You may have a situation where gangs take over the country and they become the new rising leadership that is governing the nation. You may have a situation where there is a civil war.
Or the, or the territory could be divided into several pieces, which has happened in the past. Before, you had the northern
Kingdom.
kingdom, the republic of the west, and the south. So you could have a Somalization of the land in that sense, or a Balkanization of the territory of Haiti. And the Balkans got divided into several territories. In fact, right now, Ukraine is being balkanized because you already have about three states that have broken from the main Ukraine. So this is something that can happen. And in recent Ethiopia, the Tigray people wanted to separate themselves from the main Ethiopia, and somehow the war is still going on. So those things are happening as we speak. So it's not something so far fetched.
And I would say, having lived in Nigeria for 3 years at the height of Boko Haram, and hearing stories about even Nigeria wanting to break off into separate states itself. So it's not uncommon for a country in turmoil to have a scenario where they want to separate themselves by different pieces and no longer be one nation, but be different smaller countries operated by tribes or by smaller governing bodies.
And to follow up on the issue of prosperity, we've had some investments in Ethiopia, for example. The Tigray region is more in the northern part of Ethiopia, but you also have the southern part sort of linked to South Sudan. And we had some investment in the energy sector there. So, well, we were recently advised that due to the general situation of the country, that they cannot report to us how our investment is being used, in that sense. So that which leads to people losing trust in investing in Ethiopia, for example.
Yeah. And so if you don't have investors that are investing in infrastructure, businesses, or anything else inside of the country, then you have a stagnation that may happen. And that definitely leads to the path of destruction.